There is one thing that nobody tells you about closed forests, far from signal, far from road, far from any person. It is not the dark. It is not the silence. It is when you realize that the silence stopped. I am going to tell you a story about 6 friends who decided to camp far from everything. No cell phone, no internet, nothing. Just them, the forest, and a campfire. They went to look for rest, but what they found was something else. This story is not science fiction. It is not supernatural in the sense that you are used to. It is the type of thing that makes you think twice before entering any dense forest, any trail without signal, any place where you need to trust only your eyes and your ears. And I already warn, your ears can betray you. Lucas was 28 years old, and the idea had been his. He was always like that, the guy who organizes, who convinces, who says it will be incredible, and the group believes. There was a way in him to make anything seem like adventure. When he called to arrange something, people already knew it would be different, not because he was crazy or impulsive, but because he truly believed in every plan he made, and that way of believing spread to everyone around. There were 6 in total: Lucas, Daniel, Sophia, Anna, Marcos, and Raphael. Friends for years, the type of group that does not need a reason to gather, only needs an idea and a date. Each one with their personality, each one with their unwritten role inside the group. Lucas organized, Daniel questioned but ended up agreeing. Sophia documented everything with camera or phone. Anna took care of everyone without anyone asking. Marcos was the calmest, the oldest by about 5 years, the one who rarely got surprised by anything. And Raphael was the one who slept anywhere, at any time, with any noise around. The idea was simple: 3 nights camping in a forest that Marcos knew from a trail he had done years ago. Beautiful place, river nearby, no tourists there, no car noise, nothing. Marcos remembered that the trail was good, that the clearing was spacious, that the river water was clean enough to cook. He had gone alone the last time and always wanted to return with someone. The type of place that seems perfect until you are inside it.
They arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sun was still high, which was good, because setting up a tent in the dark is exactly the type of thing that stresses even the calmest. The forest was dense, but the trail was clear, marked here and there by stacked stones and tied branches that Marcos recognized from the previous time. They set up the tents in a clearing near a big rock that worked as a table, lit the fire before it got dark, and spent the first hour laughing. It was exactly what they wanted. Daniel played guitar. Sophia photographed everything: the group, the fire, the trees, the light dying between the branches. Anna made popcorn in a small pan, and everyone complained because it burned on the bottom and was raw on top, but they ate it anyway because everyone was hungry. Raphael slept early because Raphael always slept early, even before it got completely dark, wrapped in the sleeping bag as if he were at home. Lucas stayed awake looking at the sky, which, without the artificial light of the city, was another sky, too full, too bright, the kind that makes you feel small in a good way. No phone signal, no problem. Until around 2 in the morning, Anna was the first to hear it. She had woken up to use the bathroom, which in that case was any tree outside the clearing. She went out quietly, being careful not to turn on the flashlight too strong and wake anyone. Did what she had to do, breathed the fresh air of the early morning, stayed for a second looking at the sky the same way Lucas had stayed hours before. And on the way back, she stopped. There was a sound coming from the forest. not from one specific side. It was hard to locate, as if it came from several points at the same time, or as if the forest spread the sound in a way that made it impossible to know the direction. And the sound itself was wrong. It was not an animal she did not recognize. It was worse than that. It was an animal she almost recognized, like a call of a night bird, but too deep, like a bark, but too slow, with pauses too long between each syllable, like someone who heard an animal making that sound once, years ago, and was trying to reproduce from memory. She stood still for almost a minute, waiting. The sound stopped. It was not gradual. It was not like an animal that finishes what it is doing and goes away. It was a clean cut, as if someone had pressed a button. And that cut somehow was more disturbing than the sound itself. She went back to the tent and stayed awake the rest of the night, lying with eyes open in the dark, listening to Sophia's breathing on the other side of the tent, counting the minutes until the sky got light. In the morning, she told Lucas, tried to be rational, tried to describe with precision, but it was difficult because the sound did not have an easy name. It did not fit in a simple category. Lucas listened carefully and said it was probably a night bird, that the forest confuses the sound, that tiredness distorts what we hear. She agreed because she wanted to agree, because agreeing was easier than the alternative, because the alternative was to say that the sound seemed intentional, and nobody wanted to start the second day camping with that idea in the head. They made coffee, ate bread with what had been left from the previous night, walked to the river. The morning was beautiful, the type of morning that makes you understand why people like camping. Cold water, smooth stones under the feet, the light entering through the roof of the trees in angles that seemed calculated by someone with good taste. It was Marcos who found the footprints. He had gone a little farther than the others, following the river to see if there was a deeper part to swim. He liked to explore, always had liked, and the group already knew that when Marcos went out to take a walk, he came back with something interesting, a different stone, a strange plant, a good view just after a curve. This time, he came back different. The marks were in the mud at the edge of the river, in a part where the ground was softer, where the water had receded recently and left an almost smooth surface, perfect to register anything that cast there. They were hoof marks, split in the middle, like goat or deer, but too big than any of those animals would come close, and too deep. The type of depth that you only see when something very heavy passes there, when the weight concentrated in a small point sinks deep in the soft mud. But what did not make sense was the arrangement. 2 marks, parallel, spaced like steps of someone who walks upright. Not 4 alternating legs like any hoofed animal. 2 legs, side by side, advancing one at a time like a being that walked vertically, like a being that had learned to use the front legs for something other than supporting weight on the ground. Marcos stayed looking for a while before calling the others. He wanted to be sure of what he was seeing, wanted to find the obvious explanation that he was sure was there, that he just needed one more second to see. But the more he looked, the less the explanation appeared. He called the others. They stayed looking together, in silence first. The type of silence that happens when a group of people is processing the same thing at the same time, and nobody wants to be the first to say what they are thinking. Daniel was the first to speak, said that it was probably some animal that had stepped in a strange way, that the mud distorts the shape, that they were looking for pattern where there was none. It was a good explanation. It was an explanation that everyone wanted to accept. Marcos did not answer. He was looking into the forest. The forest was dark even with the sun high, because the trees were old and dense and did not let much light pass. But there was enough clarity to see up to a certain depth before everything turned into shadow. And in that band of clarity, about 30 meters away, there was a figure. It was tall,
very tall. Too tall to be human in a comfortable way. Not absurdly tall, but tall enough for you to notice immediately. And it was standing in a way that animals do not stand. Animals move, breathe, adjust weight, get distracted. That figure was still in the way that stones are still, in the way that things that do not breathe are still. And it was facing them, not sideways, not with its back, facing, looking. Marcos blinked, not because he wanted to, but because eyes do that when they stay open too long. And in the time of a blink, the figure disappeared. Did not run, did not move, did not fade behind a tree, simply stopped being there.
Marcos did not tell anyone what he had seen. Not at that moment. He kept that like one keeps something that you are not sure if really happened or if it was your mind playing a trick. You keep it to see if time solves it, if the explanation appears by itself, if you wake up the next day and the memory became less sharp. The memory did not become less sharp. They went back to the camp earlier than they planned. There was no explicit collective decision. It was more like a silent consensus that formed without anyone needing to propose. Sophia stopped photographing. Anna started to organize the things that were spread. Daniel said he was hungry and started to walk back, and the others went along because walking back was better than staying there near the mud with those marks. Lunch was quiet, not the comfortable silence of people relaxing, but the tense silence of people thinking but not wanting to be the first to think out loud. Raphael was the only one who seemed normal, eating calmly, not noticing the atmosphere that had settled in the group, or noticing and not caring, which was his way with many things. Anna kept looking at the edge of the clearing, not at the sky, not at the trees in general, at the specific point where the light stopped and the dark began, that invisible border between their space and everything that was on the other side. It was in the afternoon that Marcos told what he had seen. He waited for Raphael to go out to get more firewood, not because he wanted to hide from Raphael specifically, but because he wanted a smaller group, a more controlled conversation. He told carefully, with details, without drama, the tall figure, the strange stillness, the instant disappearance. He knew it sounded like madness, but told anyway, because keeping it was becoming too heavy. The reaction was exactly what he expected: polite distrust, nervous joke, an attempt to change subject. Lucas said it was some branch in a strange position, that forest light does that we see shapes where there are none. Daniel said that maybe it was someone from another camp, some other hiker who got scared with them and left quickly. But Sophia said something that nobody expected. She said in a low voice, as if she needed courage to speak, "I saw it too. Last night, when I went to get water, I thought I was sleepy. I thought it had been a dream." The silence that came after was different from the other silences of the day. It was a silence that weighed, that had texture. And then Anna said, "The sound I heard at dawn, it was not a bird." Nobody answered that. They decided to leave the next day, early. There was no long debate, there was no resistance. The decision was almost automatic, as if all were already thinking about it and only needed someone to say it first. They would sleep one more night, pack everything in the morning, and leave as soon as it got light. The exit trail was known. It had been the same as the entry, marked in specific points by Marcos on the way in. They knew the path. It was a simple plan. Except the forest was not with simple plans.
They woke up before the sun and started walking without coffee, without breakfast, without conversation. Backpacks on their backs, flashlights in hand, the group compact, each one close enough to the other to hear the breathing of the one beside. 1 hour later, Marcos stopped. The others stopped together. Lucas was going to ask what it was, but saw Marcos's expression and stayed quiet. Marcos was looking to the left, to a specific tree. Bark lighter on the side that received more light. Broken branch in Y shape, about 2 meters from the ground. He had seen that tree before. He had marked that tree on the way in, mentally, as reference. And now he was seeing it again, after 1 hour walking in the opposite direction. They had walked in a circle. They tried again, with more attention this time, paying more care at the forks, marking trees with tape that Sophia had in her backpack. They walked 40 minutes and found the first tape they had placed. They tried a third time in a completely different direction, almost perpendicular to the others. 80 minutes later, the triangle-shaped rock that was about 100 meters from the camp appeared in front of them. Marcos's compass spun. Not much, not in an obvious way, but enough so that north was not reliable, so that any navigation based on it was slightly crooked enough to close a circle without noticing. They stopped, looked at each other. Nobody said anything for a while. Daniel was the first, said that it was probably magnetic interference, that some rock formations do that it was not impossible. Lucas said they would try to climb a tall tree to see if they could orient themselves by the sun or by some visual reference above the canopy. Marcos said that the sun was covered, that there was no good reference. Raphael said he was hungry and asked if they could eat something before continuing. Nobody laughed, but in another way it would have been funny. They tried 2 more times, in silence, with determination, without panicking. But each attempt ended in the same place, or in a place they recognized from before. The fallen trunk with green moss, the fork with the smooth stone in the middle, the clearing where they had camped. The sun was going down. Walking in the forest in the dark without reliable orientation was worse than waiting for the day. They camped again, without setting the tents properly, without making a real fire, without eating much. They just stopped, because continuing was spending energy without going anywhere. Nobody slept. The second night was when the thing became different from everything they could rationalize. Lucas woke up because he heard Sophia calling him by name, clear voice, recognizable, outside the tent, about 20 meters in the direction of the forest. It was not a scream for help. It was a normal call, like when you call someone in a house. Lucas? Just that, 1 time, and then another, a little farther. He went out without thinking much, because it was Sophia's voice, and Sophia was asking for something. Walked to the edge of the clearing. There was nobody. Stayed standing, calling her name. Nothing. Went back to the tent and found Sophia awake inside it, sitting, wide eyes, who said immediately, "I heard you calling me from outside." Neither of them had gone out. Neither of them had called anyone. They stayed sitting in silence, looking at each other for a long time. At dawn, Daniel woke Anna in the same way, his voice unmistakable, calling her name out there, urgent but not in panic. She ran out and found Daniel inside his tent, who had woken up with her shouting his name as she left. Raphael did not wake up with anything. Raphael slept like a rock. They spent the rest of the night sitting together around the remains of the fire, 5 of them, without sleeping, without talking much. When someone tried to start an explanation, it died in the middle, because there was no explanation that reached the end without finding a hole that did not close. The sound came back at dawn, closer this time, longer, and there was in it something that was not there before, a variation, an attempt of melody, as if it was learning, adjusting, getting better at whatever it was doing, getting better at sounding like them. On the third moment, Raphael disappeared. The tent was open, the zipper pulled without hurry, like someone who left normally. The sleeping bag was empty and cold, which meant that it had been some time since he left. His flashlight was there inside, the cell phone, and the boots, which was the detail that froze everyone, because nobody goes out to walk in a forest in the dark barefoot. Nobody does that voluntarily. They shouted his name for hours, searched the clearing in expanding waves, each round a little deeper into the forest, each round ending with nothing. They went to the river, they went to the footprints which were still there, now with other marks around, smaller which could be boots, but nobody wanted to analyze too much. Nothing of Raphael. Lucas wanted to keep searching. Marcos said they needed to try to leave before it got dark. Daniel stayed silent, listening to both without taking a side. Sophia cried quietly. Anna stood still, looking at nothing, with that expression of someone who was processing an information that the brain refuses to accept. They stayed, not by decision, but by inability to decide. And when the sun went away, they lit what was left of the fire material and stayed together in the circle of light, without sleeping, listening to the forest around.
On the afternoon of the fourth day, Raphael came back. He came out of the forest from the same direction that the entry trail arrived, walking slowly, regular steps, looking at the ground, without hurry, without desperation, without the state that someone who spent 3 days lost in a forest should have. Clothes relatively clean, neutral expression. They ran to him, hugged, asked, spoke over each other. He answered everything. Said that he got lost on the first night, that he woke up without reference of direction, that he walked for a long time without finding the camp. Said that he found a natural shelter, a rock formation with enough cover, and stayed there waiting for something to change. Said that he lost track of time. Said that he was fine. The answers were short, correct, covered all the obvious questions. But there was something in the answers that was like a piece of clothing that was washed in the wrong size. It looked the same, but did not fit the same. Too fast, without unnecessary details, without those digressions that happen naturally when a person is excited to tell what they lived. Each answer had exactly the necessary size, nothing more, nothing less. Anna was the first to notice the eyes. It was not the color, it was not the size, it was the movement. He blinked too rarely, as if the automatic reflex of blinking was being controlled instead of happening naturally. And when he looked at someone, he did not look away. He stayed, fixed, without the natural movement that eyes do when they are comfortable, when they are not monitoring, when they are just existing. Raphael's eyes monitored, in the same way that the figure between the trees had monitored. Nobody slept that night, 5 of them awake around the fire, and Raphael lying in the tent, supposedly sleeping. And from inside Raphael's tent, from time to time, came a sound. Low, almost inaudible, like someone practicing words that they still do not fully master. They were sitting around the fire, the 6 of them, and the discussion had reached a point where nobody knew anymore what to propose. Lucas insisted that they needed to try to leave early in the morning, that they would try a different direction, that they could not give up. Marcos stayed quiet for a while, and then said in a low voice that he was not sure if leaving was the main problem at that moment. Nobody needed to ask what he meant by that. Raphael was sitting with them, listening to the conversation, with that way of participating without really participating, of being present without being truly present. From time to time he agreed with his head. From time to time he made the correct expression for what was being said. From time to time, for a second, he forgot to make the correct expression. And then a voice came from the dark,
Not from inside the group, not from any of them. From outside the circle of light, from the edge where the glow of the fire died and the darkness of the forest began. The voice was calm. It was not a whisper, but it was not loud. It was the volume of someone speaking in a normal conversation. The voice said, "Now we are 7." Nobody moved for a second. No muscle, no blink, no audible breath. Then Lucas stood up slowly, turned to the dark with the flashlight, and swept the edge of the clearing. Nothing. No figure, no eye reflecting light, nothing that was tree and shadow. He turned back to the group and counted, out loud, pointing to each one. Lucas, Daniel, Sophia, Anna, Marcos, Raphael. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6. They had always been 6. Daniel counted again, because sometimes we need to confirm. Same number, same faces. But Sophia looked again. And when she counted, slowly, carefully, looking at each face and waiting before going to the next, the number did not close at 6.
They tried again and again, each one counting in turn, in silence, and the number oscillated. Sometimes it closed at 6, and you looked at the group and saw 6 known faces. But when you tried to count one more time from another angle, starting from another person, the number reached 7 before you expected. And what made that, in a specific way, unbearable was that when you looked directly at any person in the group, it was someone you knew. It was Lucas, Sophia, Daniel, Anna, Marcos, Raphael. Each one individually was recognizable, familiar, but the total did not close. Like a simple math account that should give 6 and kept giving 7 without you being able to find the error. Anna started to cry without noticing. It was not a cry of despair. It was the type of cry that the body makes when the mind finds something that it does not have tools to process. Raphael was sitting, watching all that, with that calibrated expression, in that silence of someone who is observing without a hurry to manifest. It was Marcos who spoke. He had stayed quiet more than all during that last hour, and when he started to speak, the voice came out in a tone that the others had not heard from him before. Not of fear, of recognition, like someone who was trying to remember something that had been stored for a long time in a corner of memory that adult life does not usually visit. He said that his grandmother told a story that he had heard when he was a child, when he still lived with her, on nights when he stayed awake late listening to her speak. She was the type who knew many things about the invisible world, not in a mystical and exaggerated way, but in the quiet way of someone who grew near the forest and learned to respect what the forest had inside. He never took it very seriously. We do not take grandmother stories seriously until the day we need them. Marcos's grandmother called it Goat Man. She never described the appearance in detail. She said that changing form was part of what it was, that trying to fix an image was a waste of time because it did not have a fixed image, but there were constant characteristics. It was tall, but not in a way that scares at first sight. Tall enough for you to notice and feel that something is slightly wrong, but not so tall that you immediately understand what it is. It stayed still where there was cover, where the light was bad, where you needed to look carefully to see. And when you looked carefully, it disappeared. And what it did, according to the grandmother, was a simple thing and much more frightening than any direct violence. It copied.
It started with sounds. Sounds of animals, of birds, of things that you would expect to hear in a forest, but always wrong by a millimeter, always with some detail off, something that made you stop for a second and think that was not right before continuing to walk. It was a way of calibrating, of learning the vocabulary of the place before starting to use it. Then it moved to voices. Voices of people in the group, calling each other by name with the correct intonation at the correct volume for the correct reason. The grandmother said that it needed time for that it was not immediate, that it listened for hours before trying to imitate, that each voice it copied became more precise than the previous one, that the objective of the voices was to separate, to take a person from the group, to lead them far from the light and from the company, to leave them alone in the dense forest for enough time. Marcos stopped, breathed, continued. The grandmother said that when it stayed with someone alone for enough time, it did not kill, at least not in the obvious way. There was no body, there was no blood, there was no sign of struggle. The person came back, always came back, but with something missing and something different in its place, something that the grandmother called changing the core. Not the whole body, not the memory, not the name. Something smaller and harder to name, the part that makes a person be themselves from the inside out, the part that blinks without thinking to, that gets distracted when it does not need to be alert, that feels uncomfortable when someone looks for too long. The person came back correct on the outside, wrong on the inside. And the seventh, Marcos said, was the sign that it was ready for the next. The grandmother did not explain well what the seventh was, if it was itself inserting into the group, if it was a fragment of what remained from the people it had taken before, if it was something that the human mind does not have a word to name. Only that when the group started to count and the number did not close properly, when someone extra appeared without anyone being able to point who the extra was, it was because it was choosing the next. The silence after that lasted longer than any silence of the previous night. And then Raphael turned to Marcos, slowly, with that neck that rotated a little too correctly, with those eyes that blinked twice in a row in the same interval, as if it had learned to do that by watching someone, and said, with his voice almost perfect, "Your grandmother told very good stories." He smiled, in the correct way, with the correct muscles of the face, but it took 1 second more than it should to happen. And it was that second that broke everything. They ran. There was no decision, no exchange of looks, no one saying, "Let's go." It was reaction, pure and immediate, as if for an instant all had understood the same thing at the same time, without needing to put into words. Lucas stood up first, but the others were already moving before even realizing. They ran through the dark with the flashlights shaking in their hands, the light cutting disconnected pieces of trunks, roots, and uneven ground, without direction, without plan, without any real attempt to orient themselves. Only far, far from the clearing, far from the fire, far from Raphael and the smile that had not reached the eyes. At no moment did they hear steps behind them, no branch breaking, no breathing that was not theirs, no voice calling by name. And that was worse, because it gave the feeling that there was no need to run after them. When the sky started to get light, they were on a road, asphalt under their feet, a faded white line on the side, and that different smell of open place, as if the normal world had been there waiting for them all the time. There were 5. Nobody commented. Nobody asked who was missing. And that was the first sign that something was still wrong.
And then Raphael turned to Marcos, slowly, with that neck that rotated a little too correctly, with those eyes that blinked twice in a row in the same interval, as if it had learned to do that by watching someone, and said, with his voice almost perfect, "Your grandmother told very good stories." He smiled, in the correct way, with the correct muscles of the face, but it took 1 second more than it should to happen. And it was that second that broke everything. They ran. There was no decision, no exchange of looks, no one saying, "Let's go." It was reaction, pure and immediate, as if for an instant all had understood the same thing at the same time, without needing to put into words. Lucas stood up first, but the others were already moving before even realizing. They ran through the dark with the flashlights shaking in their hands, the light cutting disconnected pieces of trunks, roots, and uneven ground, without direction, without plan, without any real attempt to orient themselves. Only far, far from the clearing, far from the fire, far from Raphael and the smile that had not reached the eyes. At no moment did they hear steps behind them, no branch breaking, no voice calling by name. And that was worse, because it gave the feeling that there was no need to run after them. When the sky started to get light, they were on a road, asphalt under their feet, a faded white line on the side, and that different smell of open place, as if the normal world had been there waiting for them all the time. There were 5. Nobody commented. Nobody asked who was missing. And that was the first sign that something was still wrong.